Hey, FFR listeners, if you love getting to listen in on our convos each week, consider helping us keep bringing our signature brand of feminist pop culture analysis to you by joining our Patreon community at patreon.com/femfreak. You can get early access, exclusive bonus episodes, participate in AMAs, join our friendly Discord server, and more. That's patreon.com/femfreak. See you there.
Yeah, a corporation might own Black Panther, but it's now ours. Right? Like that we have this, it is our collective cultural love of this thing or hatred of this thing or what have you that makes it real and makes it bigger than something that one company can say, I own this. Welcome to Feminist Frequency Radio. This is the show that asks you to be critical of the media you love. I'm Anita Sarkeesian, and I'm joined by Captains of Industry, Carolyn Pettit.
Mwahahaha. That's my rich
That's
person
how they sound.
Counting my money sound. I'm rich and I'm counting my money. That's what I want you to imagine while I make that noise.
Awesome.
I've got a monocle, and a top hat on.
Rich people eyewear.
Yeah.
Ebony, do you have a sound you'd like to make as your Captain of Industry today?
I wish I had, because I am sitting here like Scrooge McDuck throwing gold coins into the air and like sliding down a mountain of jewels.
Perfect. Now that we have that visual, today we're going to be talking about the ways that our media consumption and pop culture fandom are tied in troubling ways to capitalism and the market economy.
All right.
Yo, everybody.
What's up, everybody?
Carolyn and I are tired.
Well, full disclosure, y'all recorded a podcast episode immediately preceding this that I was not on. So y'all must have really been like getting into it.
Ebony's hatred of Spider-Man, you know.
Don't throw me to the wolves like that.
You're gonna be I mean
She
you're
was
gonna
like,
be
I
the next. You
refuse.
should be the next villain in the next Spider-Man movie. That's how much you hate Spider-Man. You just want to destroy Spider-Man.
Yeah,
So-
Ebony was like, no fucking
Yeah.
way. I'm not seeing that goddamn movie.
Yeah.
Yeah, I was so full with it. No, sometimes I'm like, I cannot get to the movie theater.
Sure, yeah.
And
You know
this one, I will see it eventually, but I was in no rush to see it, despite thinking Tom Holland is adorable as Spider-Man.
such a good Spider-Man.
Loving Spider-Man Into the Spider-Verse. Huh?
He's such a good Spider-Man. He's such a good Peter Parker.
So, I mean, I'll see it eventually, but also, like, y'all didn't need me for that discussion, so happy to moonwalk into the background.
Well, let's talk about some more pleasant pop culture fandom conversation. Wow. I got nothing today, y'all. I need someone to like whisper in my ear the words for me.
You need your person in the you need your Ned, you know.
I do. I need my Ned.
Yeah.
Oh, one thing I didn't even mention, that reminds me real quick. One thing I didn't even mention in our Spider-Man convo that I wanted to is that in both movies, Peter ends up with talking to a female-voiced computer assistant, and I'm like, you know, like what's with the, you know, come on, all the like.
Well, that's
female...
because Tony Stark is a piece of shit.
Yeah,
What?
I mean, well, of course, the fans will go, yeah, but Tony Stark had what's his face who became Vision, you know, Paul Bettany in his ear and like, yeah, but still, like, there's a pattern of AI assistants in real life and in entertainment being female coded and also kind of like deferential and I don't know, you know, all that stuff.
Because women got to do all that emotional labor, whether we're real or not.
Yeah, exactly.
All right, y'all. There is a lot to celebrate about our increasingly diverse mainstream media landscape. Modern audiences can immerse themselves in so many different kinds of compelling stories from which people of color, the disabled, queer people, basically anyone who wasn't middle class, straight, and white, had traditionally been excluded. It's a victory of a sort, but it only goes so far. We still have so far to go in terms of representation in our media, but more than that, can we ever really look to corporate media to independently advance the culture in a progressive, meaningful, and sustainable way? How do we ensure mindful engagement with media and demand accountability from the billion-dollar behemoth behind our favorite media properties?
So
how can we do it? Write in and tell us.
Yeah, we don't have any answers.
555.
We do not have answers.
Operators are standing by.
Speak for yourself. I have answers.
Oh, give them to me.
Well, hit us. Or not.
No, please.
Okay,
was that pause so that I would give you the answer?
Tara and I were both like, awesome, let's hear it.
Yeah. So I feel like this is
we took you seriously.
I think this is a particularly timely conversation because so much has been happening lately. I think particularly so a few weeks ago, the announcement of, and I'm sorry, I'm blanking on her name, but a young black woman was announced as having been cast, Halle Bailey.
Halle Bailey.
Yeah.
Halle Bailey.
As Ariel in the upcoming live action, Little Mermaid film. And understandably, this news was met with jubilation and excitement. And yet, there are those who I think are rightfully saying things like, we can't believe that Disney cares about these issues. We can't praise them for,
right.
for doing the right thing for the right reasons. They know that we're at a point where doing something like this is not going to meaningfully hurt the bottom line. It may even help the bottom line in some sense because it's pulling in maybe viewers who wouldn't otherwise come. Though obviously there is that segment of the population that's going to be upset and angry. But so my frustration as a person who is kind of anti-capitalist and does recognize that, yes, we can't say, oh, thank you, Disney, for being, being progressive, or doing the right thing. But also recognizing that this shit actually matters. As a queer person, sometimes I'll see stuff on Twitter that's from other queer people who are some queer people care too much about mainstream representation. It's don't you know that queer filmmakers have been making avant-garde, queer films forever? Your representation is out there. It exists. Look to such and such and such and such. And I'm yes, absolutely. Queer people should know maybe the history of queer art and know that these films and representations exist. But the reason we care about this is because there's a larger cultural impact, a normalization, a meaningful change is aided when representations happen in big mainstream media. We don't have to like that that's the reality. We can have feel conflicted about it, but it is the reality. So I'm always, I'm always sort of torn about these things because, I think it's great. These things need to happen. But at the same time, yes, that doesn't mean we should go around saying that, oh, I'm going to give all my money to Disney because they did such and such, because Disney doesn't actually give a fuck,
Yeah, absolutely. There's a really kind of, troubling aspect of, fan celebration of certain media properties, say Captain Marvel or Black Panther or films like that, where the implication is because these movies were financially successful, that's part of the justification for why we should do them, right? Oh, okay, so they made money, so yeah, we should. And it's no, we need better and more nuanced and more varied representations, not simply or not only because it's going to make some company billions of dollars. And conversely, because something is not a market success does not mean that there's not an audience for it or that it's not important in some way. But we keep hearing the box office is king, right? And so it becomes an excuse and a rationale both to create certain things or to not create other things. And it's so hard to see a way outside of, this capitalist mindset where all creative decisions are ultimately driven by how much money can this make or how much money will this lose.
Yeah. I mean, at Disneyland theme parks, you have employees who are homeless, living in their cars because they can't afford, Nike scores huge points when they run an ad with Colin Kaepernick, which is a fantastic ad and or whatever, or they say, we were going to make these shoes with the Betsy Ross flag, but Colin told us that's a symbol of racism, so we're not going to do it. But, and then on Twitter, it's these explosions of, hell yeah, I'm going to, buy another pair of Nike shoes or, whatever, and mocking all the people on the right who are ridiculous and saying like, oh, I'm boycotting Nike now. Oh,
Right.
but weren't you already boycotting Nike 6 months ago? But it's like, Nike, like their shoes are made, they pay a pittance to factory workers in like third world countries to make their shoes. Like they're not, a force for good globally. Like, this shit, like, doesn't that shit matter the most? Like, why aren't they paying their employees a living wage? They pull in billions of dollars. It's disgusting. Like we have to recognize that these things, matters of representation and the messages sent by advertising, like Nike's, absolutely matter. It absolutely matters. But we can't confuse that with the companies themselves being like noble or good when they still perpetuate the same horrible exploitative labor practices and things that they've always relied on.
Yeah, I mean, the whole point of feminist frequency, right? The whole beginnings and, continued existence of it is about, promoting this notion that our media, for good or for ill, both reflects and shapes culture. But we're in a moment these days with our pop culture fandom in which people love to look to these corporate brands as like models for activism. And I just, you will be left, it's insufficient. You will be, left high and dry if, the way that you get woke is by following Arby's on Twitter or, investing all of your activist energy in how, Disney or Marvel or, whoever presents a character to you.
I think there's a constant tension for media activists between moral imperatives and financial ones. Mm-hmm. And corporations don't care about morals by law, like literally by law. The only corporations are beholden to their shareholders and they have to make more money each quarter or they're failing. And so by way of that, the only way that we get corporations to make any changes is to put pressure on them financially. And that can be through PR, right? That like bad PR can hit them in ways that are financially damning, or by like, not buying their product, which I have a lot of feelings about boycotts. But as I've been doing this work and actually talking to people who make media, like they always want data-driven, market-based arguments as to why they should have female characters, about why they should have women of color, about why they should have, diversity, for lack of a better word, in their media. And that is one of the most frustrating things to me, because the reality is that they're not going to do anything unless there is a financial benefit to it. Or they could be... the financial benefit could be like they were the first ones to do this thing and they get a lot of praise for it. But for the most part, they don't really want to take these what they consider to be risks. And so I think that there's this constant tension of like, how much do we celebrate the fact that we are now getting female superheroes and, the one movie of Black Panther, right? Like how much should we celebrate that stuff? Because it actually does have a very real impact versus remembering that these are corporations whose only interest is financial. And I think that the tension of this comes from the fact that like these are creative endeavors at the end of the day. That like we grow attached to these characters, that these stories have meaning to us. And they have meaning to us because humans gravitate towards story. Like we create story out of nothing because that's how our brains operate and work. And the fact that corporations have taken over this storytelling traditions, it's not passed down community to community. It's passed down through blockbuster film or Netflix or what have you. And so I'm kind of loosely hitting on a lot of different things here, but I think that there's something to be had about like I think it's a very complicated space we sit in when we find so much emotional connection and attachment to characters that are created by corporations.
Yeah, particularly when, it shapes, as we know that it does, our perception of real life people. So it's wonderful that we have Black Panther, right? It's wonderful that we have characters like Captain Marvel or, Rey from Star Wars. But the reality is we are still getting a fairly narrow spectrum of heroes in our mainstream media, such that, yeah, we do get, more people of color, but it's, able-bodied, largely straight people of color, or, people who are conventionally attractive, so it's still a very marketable model of diversity that we're being given. And, we need to, as audiences, recognize that, as you say, Anita, it's always for these companies, there's a company imperative, a brand imperative that trumps whatever individual creators working through that brand may wish to, put out.
Something I mentioned on the entertainment news last week, is that as we're recording this, it's been, recently announced that Lashana Lynch is going to take on the 007 designation in I believe, the next Bond film. And it's, again, as much as I think, okay, that's probably a good, exciting thing to do with that franchise and that number, which historically, has so many associations, I can't help but be cynical about it and say, well, obviously, they deemed, and I'm sure they did, all kinds of analysis around this, they deemed that such a dramatic decision would generate hype and excitement and pull in viewers net overall, rather than the number of viewers who might be drawn in to see a Bond film who otherwise wouldn't care is greater than the number of viewers who would typically go to a Bond film but are going to not go because of this news. It is a profit driven, or at least a profit approved kind of decision. And that's because the landscape has changed so much, right?
Yeah.
That it's not really a risk to do it anymore.
Yeah.
That it is a very understandable landscape of there's going to be people who are going to get mad about this and they're going to freak out and do the thing that they do, and then everyone else is going to celebrate it.
Exactly. Right. And also, the recognition that there are people who will hate watch things, and newsflash, Disney's does not care if you hate pay $15 or you love pay $15.
Yeah.
They still got your $15.
Yeah. Yeah. I think that, I'm interested in this idea of the attachment that we get to these franchises, right? That I don't want to undervalue the fact. So I was this is creative media coming out of a corporate system, right? And sometimes it really feels like an algorithm wrote some of these movies, right? They're very
creative factory. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, exactly. And so and this is not at all to discount the amazing work and talent that are people who are employed in these positions to make these things happen. But I think that there's something complicated around the fact that we have so much emotional investment and ownership in Spider-Man, in Batman, in whatever it might be, in Rey, right? From Star Wars. Sorry. That I understand why we do. In the same way, I have certain characters and certain stories and certain shows that I feel very connected to and attached to. That feeling of when a show ends and you're like, oh my God, I've lost my friends, right?
Yeah.
Because it's real and it has real meaning and impact to us. I think we do this work because for those reasons, but it makes it a lot more complicated than, say, resistance to capitalism via banks. Who the fuck? We don't have any emotional attachment to a bank. And we could be yeah, Bank of America's fucking evil, full stop. But being Disney's evil, full stop, is not the same, because we're they are producing and creating these characters
sort of reanimating, right? Like bringing back to life these characters that have meant so much to us throughout our lives. So I'm really interested in sort of fan production and fan ownership, which, right? So like the fans creating media products outside of the corporate structure, whether it is approved or not by the owners, the copyright holders, the people who are like, I haven't seen media that reflects my interests, so I'm gonna ship characters, or I'm gonna create queer relationships for characters that are not represented in the media otherwise. I think there's something really interesting there, right? And the tension between fans and corporations, and like sometimes corporations are like, okay, we're going to let fans do this because we know it's good for a bottom line. And sometimes they'll be like, well, no, we're going to send out cease and desists and copyright claims on all of these things, right? Like it's this really complicated tension here.
I mean, like sense? Disney, for instance, is famously litigious about its intellectual property, right? But I think about things like, I mean, I'm not a huge Harry Potter fan, but I always did love when I would see fan art of like Black Hermione, or things like that. I'm sitting here in my Keanu Reeves Memorial recording studio, looking at all of the Doctor Who memorabilia I have. And yeah, I get what you're saying, Anita. Like, I have invested a significant part of, like, I have shaped, or my personality has been shaped by my love for this property, this character, these characters. And I show that partially by how I spend my money. And when you really kind of unpack that, it's troubling, it can be really fucked up, because we're not talking about me, spending money, for the most part, from like, independent creators who are making fan things. I'm talking about, excuse me, licensed memorabilia. Like, how much does it cost to be a fan? That's what it comes down to.
Yeah. So sorry. Can I just read a quote that's not related to what you said and then come back to that?
Yes.
Sort of going back to fan-created ownership. I was reading this article, and they quote an academic in the article, so I'll link the article in the show notes. The article is talking about sort of fandom taking on imagery and making it their own. And so this is about The Hobbit, but that doesn't matter. So the quote is, "The growing disaffection for The Hobbit among existing fans of the wider franchise and among Tolkien enthusiasts in particular might be better understood as simultaneously a protest against growing corporate ownership and control over collective cultural and creative resources by individuals who claim a stake in the representation and expansion of those shared properties." And I think that quote very much like distills down this idea of like, yeah, a corporation might own Black Panther, but it's now ours, right? Like that we have this, it is our collective cultural love of this thing or hatred of this thing or what have you that makes it real and makes it bigger than something that one company can say, I own this.
Yeah. But it's such a double-edged sword in some ways, right? Because as we've seen so clearly in the past few years, the at times fan feelings of ownership over a property or a universe or whatever, just an IP, can be quite toxic if and when they object to things that are happening with that property for all the wrong reasons, like Star Wars, right? I mean,
yeah. Well, so that ownership isn't necessarily, we'll say that like if we want to protest the fact that like there's a racist representation in the media, we'll say that that's like good ownership.
Yes.
And that if you're like, I'm mad that Star Wars has women in it, that's like a bad type of ownership or a toxic type of ownership. Like we're making that claim based on our positionality because we think that that's right. But like, regardless, the backlash in all of these different ways is all because we feel ownership to corporate properties. And I guess the point that I'm trying to make here is that that media is so much more than just a product. right? And that we feel these emotional connections and ownership and attachment to them, but that there's still, but that's what makes it so complicated. And that's why living in capitalism and demanding that corporations reflect to us the communities that we see ourselves in is such a weird, complicated, messy environment to be in, right?
Yeah, God, I keep thinking about something you started off by saying, Anita, which was like, you know, now that these global corporations have kind of taken on our storytelling tradition, the way in which we understand and participate and immerse ourselves in, you know, cultural mythologies is completely changed. Like, it's not a traveling minstrel popping up in your village every 6 months, right? You know, spending a couple of nights. I know history. I know you can't listen. This is an accurate painting of how things used to be. But you see what I'm saying? Like, you know, it's not as if we have, you know, the griot, and we're sharing these stories in, you know, small community groupings anymore. We have moved to a point in which I can be watching something or reading something at the exact same time as someone in Burma and having a conversation with them online about it, you know, and just our whole way of telling stories to ourselves has changed. And yet in many ways, the reality of like corporate ownership of our stories doesn't acknowledge that. It's hard though, you know, because think about, you know, when feminist frequency videos, right? Like we would put out a video and there's a whole economy of dudes who depended on us putting out videos so that they could put out their videos, right? I mean, they weren't fan videos by any stretch of the imagination, but like the reaction economy, you know, this notion of once you put something out there, you no longer own it and anyone can do anything to it that they desire is also a problem.
Yeah. Well, also, like, you know, I believe so strongly in fair use as a principle, as a doctrine, that like I never sent takedowns on the videos that just re-uploaded my videos. Like even though there was nothing fair use about those, or like the people who used our media to attack us, like I never sent takedowns to those people, which I probably maybe should have in retrospect. But like I really do believe that like are like that whether it's corporately owned or not, it is now ours to use, right? Like that it is a bigger that pop culture is a language that we all speak now and that we should be allowed the tools of that language. So if you want to make a remix or you want to cut together an analysis of whatever, like I don't think that corporations should single-handedly own, you know, the rights to a thing or whatever, ownership. I don't believe in whatever. I'm not going to go down that spiral. But I do think that like there's a lot of complication in the fact that like these things are, it's not like you made a box and you're trying to sell a box. It's like you're selling culture. You're literally selling us culture and forming and shaping our culture and then saying, no, you can only touch it in very restrictive ways. And you can only intellectually engage with it in very restrictive ways. Like, I think about how mythology developed, right? Like, you would live in a village and the only people, your elders would pass on stories to you. And those mythologies were like, there is a monster in the river so that kids don't go to the river and drown or whatever, right? Right? Like, there are these stories that are passed down to maintain cultural, generational relevance and understanding. And I like, in my experience, that comes a lot from like learning stories about the Armenian genocide, right? Like, how do we maintain those stories? How do I maintain the experiences of my family specifically, not just like largely, and keep that within us and alive, right? But we don't do that as much anymore. And now it's like corporations who are telling us those stories, and they control like truth in a lot of ways. They control our mythologies in a lot lot of ways.
Right. I mean,
and
the oral,
like, what does that mean to us?
I know it's because it used to be that the oral tradition.
Yeah, oral traditions.
In so many cultures, right? Like stories of say King Arthur or whatever, right, would be passed down from one generation to the next, people sitting around campfires and telling stories, and like one storyteller would elaborate and like add their creative like elements to it, and these would just kind of over time become like part of the tales as they evolved. And yes, like everything about how our collective myths and legends and icons and everything are created now it's all completely not that at all anymore. But obviously, we as people continue to try to find ways to participate and to contribute and to leave our own mark on it. But yes, like obviously the corporations that own and trademark all this don't always smile on that kind of participation. Yeah.
And those mythologies hold the values of a culture.
Yes.
Right. And so when corporations are now holding the values of our culture, and they have said for decades that women are not heroes. Right. Like, just for example, it's only recently that we've been like, women get to be heroes. Or that women's only value comes from being sexualized, or that they can only be strong if they also look a certain way. Right. Like, these are all the values that have been replaced, or that have been like communicated to us through widespread pop culture as the dominant myth-making force in our society. And whatever you can replace, I'm just talking about mostly white women, but like you can replace that with all kinds of whatever the values are, right? So I think the fact that really Netflix led the way in being like, well, let's target niche audiences, which I say with some irony here, to be like, there are more people who want to see their stories reflected, and we've now seen the rise of like more representation in the media. But as we opened with, like, is it worth celebrating? Like, yes, in some ways. Is it enough? No, definitely not. And like the sort of back and forth, the non-linearness of progress in our media.
Yeah, and I also wanted to mention the pressure on marginalized communities to support things with our dollars in a way that can feel oppressive and can feel, exploitative when it comes from a corporation. So there were real calls to like go see Black Panther, for instance, on opening weekend, or Captain Marvel on opening weekend, right? Because if they don't get butts and seats, if it doesn't make enough money, then potentially we'll never have something like that again. And as a viewer, I resent having that held over me while recognizing the reality of the market forces at play here. I resent being told that my value as a participant in culture is how much money I can bring to the table. And that, if folks from marginalized communities want to have their stories told, they have to demonstrate that it's profitable to a mainstream read white audience.
I put a little more stock in those calls for, to get people to come out for that sort of thing when it's much smaller films like, say, Booksmart, right. or say Moonlight or Beale Street, like, because I recognize that those films are a little more, there's more riding on, perhaps, like, they're smaller, they're yeah. I don't know, but yes, when people are like, come out and see, AAA blockbuster film on opening day, I'm like, I don't care.
Yeah, I mean, it's very sad that the merit of art and the value of art is based on if it makes money or not. I remember years ago, I interned at an art gallery, and art galleries are very much made to sell to rich people, and so you choose what kinds of shows, or the curators choose what kind of shows they put up in order to try to sell pieces of art, right? And I remember this one exhibit we did was very political and not necessarily things that you would want to have sitting in your house, and it didn't sell. It barely sold. So that artist and that gallery made the choice to have this exhibit knowing that they're not going to necessarily recoup on that. And like that was a big reason why I didn't continue in the art world, because I was like, well, this is bullshit. But like I think about that a lot too, in terms of why, like is something like Booksmart or Beale Street or whatever, not valuable if it doesn't make money at the box office?
Right. Well, to the investors who, the producers who put up money for the making of the film, no. And right, and like, will there be people who look at the success or failure of a film like Booksmart to decide whether they're going to fund the next quirky indie film about high school, girls? Maybe,
well,
but
that's the thing too, right? Is it like there's so many things that go into financial success, right? Like in terms of marketing, like actually good marketing in the right communities, in the right spaces. Like, so sorry, that this is going into like, how do you make it be financially successful? But there's also just a lot that goes into whether something is given the worth or value. So like talking to game developers for years, like games starring female characters were never given marketing budgets, were never put out there in the same way that games with male characters were. And then they use that as a sign of failure in that and disinterest in those games.
Yeah, I mean, and like a film like Booksmart, I don't think did do well at the box office, but it is going to have lasting cultural value. I mean, this is a film that is very important to a lot of the young people who saw it, I think, who, like 20 years from now, they'll remember it. They'll probably still, watch the Blu-ray of it once in a while or whatever. Like these films or whatever holographic discs or whatever people are watching 20 years from now. Like there is the reality that, of course, there's artistic value and merit to things that are not hugely profitable. I mean, I think a lot of the best writing that happens is not what the marketplace demands, but it's still great writing. It doesn't fall in line with what big publishers want to print and sell or what have you. But in like every artistic field, like, yes, you can identify that a lot of the best or most significant art is not going to be the most profitable. And that's always been the tension too in art, and particularly like mainstream pop art, which is the kind that we at Feminist Frequency tend to be most concerned with, because it's where the biggest potential for cultural impact resides, by and large. So did we answer all the questions? Did we solve this problem?
We solved it, but Sweet. I would be interested to hear from our listeners how they find ways to be ethical consumers. Just to check, just to double cross, cross-reference against my solutions.
Yeah. Cool. Let's take a quick break.
Hey, Feminist Frequency Radio listeners, why not join our Patreon community at patreon.com/femfreak? Seriously, what are you waiting for?
Now it's time to talk about what's been thrilling us, moving us, upsetting us, or infuriating us this past week. Ebony, would you like to get us started?
Sure. Still in the same position I've been in for the past month, whereby I don't know if I can handle new media, so I've been rereading the Sandman graphic novels. Written by Neil Gaiman.
I was so obsessed with the Death novels and the Death comics. Oh, right. That was my like little 14-year-old goth heart.
Yeah, like it immediately put me back into. I mean, I'm 50 years older than you, Anita, so yeah. I wasn't a 14-year-old, but yeah, it took me back to reading these in my. Well, I mean, I didn't discover them till I was in my 20s. I wasn't, on it when they first hit the streets. But anyway, I've just been delighted to be reacquainted with Dream and the Endless, and also loving how much, like, I didn't pay attention to it at the time. My critical faculties weren't particularly well honed, but just the ways in which the evocation of a very affirmative kind of range of identities in the graphic novels, people of color, queer folks, whatever, blah, blah. Like, remembering these are coming out in the early 90s. That was by no means something you could count on in graphic novels and comics, anywhere really. So, anyways, just loving reconnecting with the Sandman graphic novels, and that's it, babies.
Maybe I'll post a photo of me dressed up as Death for Halloween.
Yo, please do.
Listeners.
Please do.
It's when I don't have a costume, it's my go-to costume because it's so easy.
Don't promise it if you're not going to deliver it.
I'll do it. Yay. All right, Carol, what are you freaking out about?
I am reading this novel, a very hefty tome indeed, called The Goldfinch by Donna Tartt, Tartt. And Donna Tartt also wrote a novel called The Secret History, which I happened to read not long after I was out of college, really, and it's very much a college novel. And it was just the right book at the right time in my life then, and it really struck a chord with me. So I think Donna Tartt is such a magnificent writer. She can evoke the atmosphere of a room like nobody's business. She can really make you feel like you're there, just the way that she can capture the atmosphere of a room. I mean, so The Goldfinch is a really fascinating novel. I'm 300 pages into this 1,000 page book, so I'm put a dent in it, but I still have a ways to go. It's I'm a little conflicted about it in the sense that I think that Donna Tartt is a writer who writes about whiteness, but it doesn't know that she's writing about whiteness. Her books are so white, but not in a sort of self-reflexive way where they're aware that they're very, very white. So I don't know, but nonetheless, the story is utterly fascinating. It deals with grief. And when she writes about grief, she does it in a way that makes me recall my own experiences of grief. The main character loses a parent, loses their mother, his mother, in this basically in this explosion at the Met, the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York, and when he's young, he's 13, I believe, when it happens, and the way that he writes about the specific experience of losing a parent and what that does to your mind and heart, and how it feels so impossible to believe or to accept. And I mean, is I was reading, I'm yeah, no, exactly. That's exactly what it's sometimes. Extraordinary. She's an extraordinary writer. It's a very captivating read. And yeah, it's being turned into a major motion picture. So if you like books specifically that get turned into major motion pictures, then this is the book.
A major,
for you.
Not just a motion picture. A major, not a minor.
Picture. No, it's soon to be a major motion picture.
All right. Well, we'll see about that.
Yeah.
So Ebony has put a gun to my head and forced me to watch Ripper Street.
It was an old-timey Victorian gun, but still pop a cap in ya.
Yeah. And she wore one of those little hats that the coppers wear. Mm-hmm. Coppers, they call them
and
coppers.
Some amazing striped pants.
The costuming is fucking great on that show.
Yeah.
I have to watch it with I watch pretty much everything with subtitles on, but especially this one because I don't know what they're saying half the time. Mm-hmm. And I'm huh? Anyways, my freak out is not about Ripper Street. I'm also not recommend. I have neutral feelings even though I can't stop watching it. But that's only because I'm depressed, not because it's actually good. But anyways, my point is that we've talked a lot on the show, in brief spurts about police procedurals and cop shows, mostly because Ebony's obsessed with them. Mm-hmm. And I wanted to point out something that bothers me in these shows, which is what Carolyn brought up last week on the Spider-Man episode, is that oftentimes, so one, on these shows, you have to have many seasons of different stories of evil people and then the state solving those crimes, right? And so without fail, there are always a handful of stories about people who are very justifiably been wronged by the state usually, and they have to be stopped in what they're doing by the state, even though the state has wronged them. And so it's really frustrating because the villains, it's like there's a very clear, proper way of dealing with being coming back from war and sacrificing for a country and having no resources when you get home, right? And so if you want to go steal or rob trains or something, like that's the wrong way to deal with it. But there's no right way to deal with it, right? Like there's no other recourse, but it's always framed as like, well, you shouldn't do what's illegal. You should just suffer in silence, right? And so I find that like that particular aspect of how sometimes these kinds of stories and these sorts of shows frame oppression as like the villain, or people who are fighting their own oppression as villainous.
And it reminds me too of like how like I'll still like get this have this happen on Twitter all the time, where I will call out something that the state has done, like a policy, or for instance, as violence. Like, like a policy that inherently dehumanizes trans people is violence, right? But people don't understand it that way, or they don't like, no, violence is, if a trans person were to resist that by going and like punching a police officer or something, that's violence. But the policy itself that dehumanizes the trans person, no, that's not violence. It's like this reluctance, or the way in which the actions of the state, whatever their impact, however they harm people, are never actually by and large understood to be violence, even when that's exactly in a sense what they are.
Yeah.
Speaking of Ripper Street, Anita, and I get that we disagree on this, but one of the things that I actually did really like about it is that, to my mind, the show was wonderful at, suggesting that the state was completely incapable of bettering anyone's lives. Like ultimately, Edmund Reed and the Lehman Street crew are completely ineffective most of the time.
Oh, totally. I completely agree with that.
I like how the show did not shy away from emphasizing just like the brutal grinding down that almost everyone was subject to, unless you were absolutely one of the like out of touch elites, right? So if you were a woman, if you were, a working woman, if you were, a person of color, whatever, like there was no safety net. There was nothing keeping you from just like grinding poverty most of the time, except for what you could, scratch out for yourself. And so I feel like I appreciated the fact that the show did not suggest that, like, oh, if you simply allow the police to take care of you, or allow the state to surveil you, or do the, right thing as a woman and get married or whatever, then your life will be shiny and clean and you'll be safe and whatever. The show, like, I watch the show and I get depressed because it's basically just like, we are all fucked.
Yeah, it is absolutely that. Like, it definitely has the police are coming in to like solve the crime, blah, blah, blah kind of thing. But
they're so incompetent, most of them.
Well, yeah, but also like your point is that like, yes, everyone is fucked. And that's the ringing theme throughout all of the seasons is like, why would you come back to Whitechapel? Whitechapel is a dumpster fire. Like everything and everyone is miserable here all the time. But at the same time, every episode is like, let's solve the problem. And some of the appeal, what I realized, because I had just rewatched Veronica Mars. Oh, I guess that should have been my freak out last week. But I had just rewatched Veronica Mars. And I think some of the appeal of these shows too is like, or at least for me, is like, it's the solving of a mystery, right? Like in watching smart people, like detective work is fascinating. And every time I watch shows like this, I'm like, could I be a detective? Which the answer is no, but I can fantasize about it on my couch. So
imagine if Anita was a private investigator. That is amazing.
So good. All right, y'all. Enough of that.
Let's come back to that in the bonus.
Thanks so much for listening to Feminist Frequency Radio. Stay tuned for the Freakin' After Party, only available to backers of this podcast, which you can learn more at patreon.com/femfreak. If you haven't yet, go to iTunes and subscribe, rate, and review us. You can follow us on Twitter, Instagram, and all the social medias at FemFreak. The show is engineered by Rob Para. Sarah Norales provides technical support, artwork by Jamie Varon, and intro music by Phil Circus. And you can find us everywhere great podcasts are found. That's not the right order. Why hasn't anyone told me that's the wrong order? It's fine. Join us next week for another feminist dive into popular culture. Thanks for listening.
Goodbye, workers.
Wow.